It's a pleasure to welcome you to the Milken Institute's 7th London Summit. Now, as you probably know, and if you don't, you should, the Milken Institute is a publicly supported nonprofit organization whose mission is to increase global prosperity by advancing collaborative solutions that widen access to capital, create jobs, and improve health. We do that through our research, our policy work, and our convenings. And this, of course, is a convening at a very important time. Europe and the world face a confluence of cultural, political, and financial uncertainties. And our panels today are going to explore some of the challenges. They'll include Brexit, disruptive technologies, immigration, global trade, climate change, and much more. Because we are a nonprofit, I want to just acknowledge the fact that we couldn't hold this event without the support of our sponsors, our supporters, including WorldQuant, the conference underwriter, and we'll be thanking them more properly at lunch. Now, let me just give you a little bit of guidance that may help you throughout the day. We have a very full day. There are going to be a great many of you here, approximately 1,000 over the course of the day, and perhaps a little more. So just a little advice, if you haven't done so yet, please download the Milken Institute app. There'll be information there about panel locations and something not in your programs, panel descriptions, as well as biographies of our speakers. And we will not be giving biographies on the stage. They'll all be on the app. Now, we're going to be live streaming a number of panels today, but videos of other sessions are going to be available on our website within a few days. Now, this is important because we are at capacity. You are not going to be able to go to all of the sessions at the same time. I don't think any of you here, as talented as you are, have 5 split personalities, so you'll undoubtedly have to miss some. So you will be able to catch up with those online afterwards. And also keep in mind that if for any reason a breakout room you want to go to is full, we're going to be having monitors outside of the room that'll enable you to watch the panels, and you can also watch them on our YouTube channel. This year, we are introducing the Milken Institute London Summit on LinkedIn. That's something new for us, and we have a new LinkedIn series. We've asked participants to make one prediction about a trend that will shape Europe over the next decade. So take a look at LinkedIn and join the discussion at hashtag MIGlobal on your LinkedIn site. So we'll have many ways for you to keep track. But the most important thing, of course, is just your presence here. You're not only hopefully gaining ideas, new insights that you haven't had before from the panels, but also very much from the discussions you'll have among yourselves. So thank you for being here, because the most important part of the conference is the incredibly high-level audience that we have here and the interactions you have with each other. So enough of the preliminaries. Let's go on to our very first panel, which is a Continental wake-up call, challenges and opportunities for a post-Brexit Europe. And this panel is moderated by Stephanie Flanders, Senior Executive Editor of Bloomberg, Head of Bloomberg Economics, and join me in welcoming Stephanie and our very distinguished panel.
Well, thank you very much. We get to say everything that people will be then trying not to repeat themselves to say in the rest of the day. But very glad to be here. And we have an excellent panel to talk about not just Brexit, I promise. Brexit plus, because really we're wanting to take a European perspective, take stock of where we are relative to maybe a few years ago when things were looking pretty bleak in continental Europe, the middle of the crisis, but also relative to the start of the year when we had so many political things up in the air. I'm going to introduce the panel in a minute, but I also wanted to sort of kick out a few opening propositions that hopefully would sort of stimulate a bit of conversation among the panelists. You know, the title refers to post-Brexit Europe. I would argue, proposition one, that Europe is post-Brexit, at least psychologically, and was quite quickly moving on to the future and thinking about the future after the British referendum last year. Second proposition, Britain is not post-Brexit. And depending on what your view on Brexit, you might think that was a good thing or a bad thing, but it seems to me the very steep learning curve that we would have said Britain had to climb after the referendum. You know, normally when you say, I've had a steep learning curve, that means you've learned a lot in a short time. I think we're very low down still on the learning curve in terms of the overall recognition of the trade-offs involved in Brexit, but maybe we went a few steps up the ladder yesterday in the back and forth over Theresa May's deal or non-deal in Brussels. We'll talk a little bit about that. I think the third thing, which I think is particular interest to many of the people of the panel and to me, is that we have chosen to, or we are in the process of trying to leave the European Union at a time when actually there's more optimism around the future of the continental economy than there has been, certainly that I can remember, but certainly since before the crisis. We may even see close to or even above 3% growth in the Eurozone this year, which was certainly not something I was expecting to see. And that is, in a real sense, actually helping to pull the economy together and maybe support politics, you know, that sort of doom loop between the bad politics of Europe and the bad economics conceivably has been broken. Whether it's been turned into a virtuous circle, we don't know, though, because we have some important centrifugal forces still operating, not just Brexit, but also on the east, pulling from the east. We have what some people think is really quite momentous developments in the rise of populist governments in Central and Eastern Europe, which could themselves threaten the integration of Europe. So I'm just throwing all of those things out there, and I know that speakers will be able to pick up and add insight to any one of those. On my far right, we have Mark Wilson, who's CEO of Aviva, Lord Mandelson, former European Trade Commissioner, former many things, British First Secretary of State, now Chairman of Global Council, Michael O'Sullivan on my left, CIO of Wealth Management at Credit Suisse, Tina Fordham, who's Citi's Chief Political Analyst, and on my far left, Michal Krupinski, who's now Chief Executive of the second biggest bank in Poland, Bank Pekao, but a former Undersecretary of State for the Polish Treasury. So we've got the full breadth. Inevitably, given the timing of this, and given what happened yesterday, I think we have to briefly start by asking you, Peter. I know you've been in Brussels and elsewhere in Europe over the last week or two. How should we read the ups and downs of yesterday, and in more particularly, what is the sort of big picture view on how Europe is looking at Brexit, not just how we constantly look at it?
Well, I've been in or talked to people in Brussels, Berlin and Paris in the last week, 10 days, and they want to move on. No doubt at all about that. I got a very clear message at a very senior level of the European Commission. The EU27 want to move from phase 1 to phase 2 of the negotiations. Essentially, they had decided that by the time of the European Council meeting next week, Britain will have made sufficient progress in reaching agreement with the EU27 in order to move on to the second phase, which is a discussion. I wouldn't call it a negotiation. I think that's a rather euphemistic term in this context. But it will be a discussion in the second phase of this process in which Britain is going to have to make a number of decisions, a number of choices from the menu that the EU27 are going to offer. Britain has not yet decided what on its own negotiating guidelines for that second phase. The Prime Minister has yet to put to the Cabinet what the goals of Britain's negotiating strategy is going to be. She's not yet got agreement from the Cabinet on what sort of trade relationship in anything other than a purely rhetorical sense will be, what it will look like, because her priority has been to move her Cabinet and sort of secure its unity to the greatest extent possible on the three issues in phase one. That's paying our tab and how much that's going to cost in order to leave the European Union, and that's sort of settled at around £50 billion. Secondly, the rights of EU citizens in the future and the role of the European Court of Justice as a sort of reference point in overseeing that. And thirdly, of course, how the border between Northern and Southern Ireland will be managed. Now, the hiccup that occurred yesterday was that on the agreement over the Irish border, which the British government and the EU27 had reached by the end of last week and over the weekend, came apart because the hard Brexiters in the Conservative Party's ranks joined forces with the DUP in Northern Ireland in order to scupper what Mrs May was doing. And that, I think, is going to be a continuing feature and hallmark of the trade negotiations in the second phase of this, because essentially you have the Conservative Party, and this fault line runs through the Cabinet as well, divided between those who want to, at all costs, minimise the disruption and damage to UK trade and the UK economy, and therefore they want the closest possible relationship between Britain and the European Union going forwards. They want the closest alignment in trade terms between the UK and the EU. You could characterise those as soft levers, but that's a very different view taken from others in the Cabinet, led by Boris Johnson and Michael Gove and others, who are basically clean breakers. I mean, they don't want that alignment. They prioritise autonomy from Europe, sovereignty, control for Britain, rather than remaining close to the regulatory model of the European Union. And this division basically is going to run through the second phase, and Mrs May will do her best to come to an end point where she feels that she's got the best outcome in future trade terms for Britain, and present that to Parliament next autumn. But it's going to be a very, very rocky passage indeed for her, for the government. That's assuming, as I believe will be the case, that by the end of this week the DUP will have put back in its box, no, that's a derogatory term, concerns assuaged.
I mean, it has been a masterclass in how Ireland, again and again, through centuries of British history, manages to be the crucial wrinkle that people haven't thought about enough. I mean, time and again has brought down governments, has been the issue that people have wrestled with. I want to turn to others, but just
we did resolve it in the Good Friday Agreement.
Well, they thought it was resolved. That's the point. You think it's resolved,
yeah,
and then it comes back to haunt you one way or another. I mean, just quickly, because I know some people will be interested in this, there was a conclusion among the sort of commentariat at the end of yesterday, or at least a perception, that this might have made much more likely a softer form of Brexit, that it's actually, this has turned out to be the wake-up call for those who thought you could square the circle, and actually we're going to end up with a softer form of, which is very relevant to the business community, that you would end up with something which was more or less being in the customs union, more or less being in the single market. Do you think that's something business people should be thinking after yesterday?
It would certainly be the best outcome for Britain and for the European Union, no question about that. Britain leaving the European Union and the political apparatus and
but in terms of the political
institutional machinery, but staying within the economic structures of the European Union. And that option has always been available to us. I mean, the European Union would be absolutely delighted if, in undertaking Brexit, we nonetheless stayed in the economic
But that had been ruled out. Do you think it's more politically possible now?
I don't see any evidence for it, because the reason why the preemptive decisions were taken right at the very beginning to exclude and put off the table what are the best trade and economic options for Britain were done by the Prime Minister and the Cabinet, because she believed the Conservative Party wouldn't wear it. And I don't see any evidence of a shift in Conservative Party opinion. Look, at the moment we're heading on a course in which the default position, and this is the greatest risk facing Britain, is that we leave without a real, meaningful, substantive trade deal at all. I mean, we might have a sort of de minimis Canada-style agreement in which we remove tariffs on goods, but that won't make a ha'porth of difference to that 80% of the UK economy, which is about exporting services and trading those cross-border into the single market. But if we don't even get the Canada deal, then we will be reverting to WTO rules. Those are sort of minimum average tariffs which go up for different sectors. But again, WTO rules which make no provision at all and do nothing for services. They only govern trade in goods. And I obviously think that's the worst possible outcome for the country. It's also very bad for the rest of Europe. But, you know, at the moment, that is the course on which we are currently set. In the end, I think it risks blowing up the economy. But if you reverse back down that cul-de-sac, you risk blowing up the Conservative Party. So it's we're in a devilish situation, and without a really substantive sea change taking place politically within the government, within the cabinet, I don't really see how we're going to airlift ourselves out of this situation and put ourselves forward and locate ourselves in a better outcome economically for us.
Michal O'Sullivan, would you say, sort of stepping back, is Credit Suisse, is the wealth management industry post-Brexit in some sense? Are you able to look past Brexit and say, actually, there's all this great stuff happening in Europe? Or is it still a constant worry that Brexit could just confuse and complicate too many things?
Well, let me do two things. I will take up the cause of Ireland, which you just mentioned. And as you said, I will try and look beyond Brexit. So I'm an Irishman living in Switzerland, so I'm biased towards small states. And in Europe, small states are the best performing economies. They're the most stable from a political economic point of view, but they don't get the attention they deserve compared to, say, Germany or France. And from a small state perspective, three things at least are germane to the future of Europe and Britain. The first is that the EU is a colossus, and Britain is now finding this out in the negotiations. For all of the tough talk coming out of Westminster, if this was a rugby or a cricket test, Britain would be losing 3-4-0 against the EU. And that would be worse if you're a small state. We saw what the EU did to Greece over the last 4 or 5 years. And if you're Denmark and you want more flexibility on immigration, or you're Portugal, you want more flexibility on the financial side, trying to exact that from the EU would be incredibly hard. So my first, I think, observation, maybe recommendation, is that small states in Europe will begin to form their own political grouping and alliance, and I think they should do that. The second one is, if you look at what European leaders are doing, we've just appointed the new leader of the finance ministers in Europe, and he comes from a small country from Portugal. And if you look at, say, Emmanuel Macron's diary, he is much less concerned about Brexit and much more concerned about moving on with building out and recompleting the Eurozone. And from the point of view about half of the members of the Eurozone, this is a big risk, because if you have a common monetary policy and you are forced to have common fiscal policy, you give away all of your flexibility. And the lesson for me of the Eurozone crisis is that common monetary policy will produce imbalances and distortions in small economies. So they have to have fiscal flexibility. This is not just an argument for low corporate taxes in Ireland, it's an argument for all of the smaller members of the Eurozone. And then finally, there hadn't been a lot of talk about global Britain, but it's a canvas, it's a template that is, for me, is pretty much empty. And I think the model for global Britain actually is found in what a lot of the smaller economies are doing, Switzerland. And the secret of these economies is what I call intangible infrastructure, the rule of law, education, technology, healthcare. The UK has got all of those, but I think from a cognitive mental point of view, it needs to reassess where it is in the world and focus on this new model of growth.
Tina Fordham, the economics is actually have improved. As I was saying at the beginning, the economics on the continent have improved significantly over the last year or so. There's a perception that populism has at least maybe passed the worst, or at least is now ebbing somewhat. But then if you're sitting to the east of different parts of Europe, you don't necessarily feel that way. How do you see the mix of the sort of economic and political dynamic?
Well, I think if we go back to the start of this year, when Trump had been elected and was taking office, and we were looking ahead to a number of important elections in Europe in systemically significant countries, especially Germany and France, also the Netherlands, amongst investors that I talked to, a lot of concern that the French elections, if you think back to January, could lead to Fragmentation, a referendum. And so that clearly hasn't happened, and indeed we have mainstream leaders having emerged in parties in first place in all of these countries. But populist parties came in second or third in every single case. And although I'm not so concerned about Angela Merkel, I think she probably will go on to a fourth term, there's no question that her political capital's undermined, and the prospect for European reforms that markets at least had been so optimistic about in this summer, with quite a bit of euphoria, is now tempered. Doom loop is exactly the expression I used in my Outlook paper this year, being full of cheer as I am as the chief global political analyst. 2017 was de-democratization and deglobalization, and then the question mark is doom loop, because we think back to the Clinton days and that famous slogan, it's the economy, stupid. I think it's not the economy, stupid. Britain voted for Brexit at a time of high growth and low unemployment. If we think ahead to 2018, to which elections in Europe are coming up, obviously Italy is the most important. Italy is posting growth for the first time in some time. The five-star movement has come in first in 9 out of 10 of the last polls. And I would venture to say that growth is happening too slowly after a period of stagnation, is not also translating into improvements in living standards for people. And probably the most important variable these days, when I talk about my Vox Populi risk thesis, which is public opinion being more volatile, is low trust. Italy and Greece have the lowest levels of trust in all institutions, government, business, civil society, of any European countries. And that's what's going to probably have the most impact in the polls, and won't be reversed on the basis of another half a point of growth, as encouraging as that is.
I mean, Michal, I think that Poland has been such a previously supportive and energetic member of the European Union. And I think there's been a perception among investors that everything's kind of going right in Europe now. We have Brexit, but actually the economy's doing well. And yes, we now have these rather volatile, unpredictable governments, whether it's in Hungary or Czech Republic or indeed Poland. But things will work out in the end, because there's this great economic interest, particularly of the people of Poland, but in the other parts of Central and Eastern Europe, in economic integration. And it just makes me nervous because we had that thought around Brexit, and we've had that thought in the past, that in the end, economics will dictate rather than politics. And as Tina says, it doesn't always work out that way. I mean, would you say that Central and Eastern Europe is still going to be a force for convergence in Europe, even despite some of these political developments?
Yes, first, thank you. First of all, Polish society is one of the most pro-European societies in Europe. Average support for the EU in Europe post-Brexit is 78%. It is 83% in Poland. At the same time, one of the most pro-American societies in Europe. So far, Brexit hasn't had effect and economic consequences on Poland and Central Eastern Europe. You have unprecedented growth, 4.7% in Poland last quarter. Romania is growing at 8%. Huge confidence boost and highest ever corporate profits. As regards long-term consequences, what we see as potential benefits is relocation of services. You had some of the global banks recently announcing relocation of global services. Poland and Citi is already a leader in shared services centers. There is what people consider a chance for an economy, that there would be some kind of alleviation on labor pressure, meaning people moving back to the country. Where we do see greatest hope is that there will be a wake-up call, a new opening in Europe, a chance for a stronger Europe, a greater focus on boosting productivity, particularly in Southern Europe, a greater focus on building Eurozone capital banking union. Where we do see risks is, first of all, on the budgets, and this is to your question on convergence. Yes, there will be convergence, provided that the structural funds are still at work. There are concerns around trade. 6.3% of exports from Poland are actually imports here in the United Kingdom, and there's an unknown fate for Polish or CE citizens in the UK. I think in terms of the end game, it is too early to say. I was hoping that Brexit would provide an incentive for structural reforms in Europe. So far, I haven't seen it. I don't think people in Brussels have been held accountable of Brexit, because at the end of the day, Brexit is not a local problem. It is a European problem. And if you take a view that this is a European problem, you should also take a view that there should be people held accountable for Brexit and similar problems in other EU member states. My worry is that with the UK leaving, you're losing an important ally for a greater integration based on freedoms. UK, according to the Heritage Foundation, is one of the top 3 countries in the world in terms of economic freedoms. You'll be losing a good ally in terms of security, European security policy, tougher stance on Russia, for example, and climate policy. And my worry is, when I look at the recent clashes between, say, France and the CE on the truck drivers question, we are back to what was happening 30 years ago, right? We are questioning a single market. If you say you can have Eurozone, it's already been raised by one of the panelists. You cannot have this is back to the basic books of economics. You cannot have Eurozone without mobility. And when I hear that the people are questioning free provision of services, I'm really worried and concerned that this is not a wake-up call.
But when you, just forgive me, but when you describe, and this is the description of Poland's approach is one that would have been similar several years ago, a great supporter for integration, a supporter, and yet you have in control of the premiership and the presidency, the Law and Justice Party, whose leader has been very vehemently against more convergence with Europe, actually talking about bringing powers back.
Well, and what about freedom of movement?
Well, and so I'm just wondering, are we falling into the trap of listening to a business community that is being optimistic rather than the reality of political dynamics?
I look at the slogan that we have here: New Europe, lead, follow, or step aside. So I think it would be difficult for CE to lead changes without the UK on board, because of how you vote in the EU, basically. I think if the answer to the current issues was stronger Europe based on freedoms and economic freedoms, and if there was an expectation for further reforms meant to boost productivity and strengthening of the EU, then again, I think CE would follow. And I cannot speak on behalf of CE, but I am talking to people and getting their views. But if the answer is further protectionism, then I'm concerned. The answer is step outside, which basically means that their Polexit is not any option. Polexit is not an option. I don't think there's any country in CE that would be in favor of exit, but there will be further support for what is considered the community of sovereign states.
Tina, do you want?
Yeah, I mean, well, first thing is I do think that there is a Brexit effect at work, which suggests, you look at the spectacle of these negotiations and the political noise that has been created, and I don't expect a European political party to offer an in-out referendum UK style. So I think and that's true for the Five Star Movement. They've taken a referendum off of their platform in Italy, more or less, so they're kind of anti-establishment more generally without offering that. So no, we're not talking about exits, but it seems to me no one is talking about the migration question and the role that played both in the referendum outcome and indeed in Merkel's weaker result and the AfD doing better, and indeed the tensions between East Central Europe and the rest of Europe have more to do with the migration question than anything else, in that those countries bitterly resented and indeed rejected Merkel's insistence that they take on refugees, and most of them take zero. And when we have 60 million forcibly displaced people in the world, most of whom are around the European periphery in one way or another, this is going to be a challenge again and again.
And it was striking in the German election that actually the alternative for Deutschland, the strongest votes were in the eastern
yes, but also where there are the fewest migrants, but that's getting down social science nerd land. Yeah.
Been very patient, Mark Wilson. I mean, taking perhaps the sort of global perspective on Europe and thinking about how investors and others should look at it now, is this in your heart? Do you feel that Europe is now broadly on the right track, will actually be moving in the direction of the right kind of reforms, and will be a bit more prepared for the next crisis? Or is there a risk that we're just, in the great economist phrase, is mistaking the cycle for the trend? You think that you mistake just a cyclical uptick, a final recovery after years of crisis, for something more fundamental and a real change in the mood?
Yeah, that's a big question. Well, morning, Stephanie. The end of the trend, I think the first law of economics is if something cannot go on forever, it won't. And neither can recession, neither can crisis. But I come from this from both a business perspective, an investor perspective, but also a perspective of having lived in Asia for 14 years. And I was thinking this morning, it's a little like a boxing match. So we're in a boxing match, and you've heard of the Thriller in Manila, or maybe the Rumble in the Jungle. Well, we'll call this the Tussles in Brussels. And in one corner, the great new hope, President Macron, wearing, I don't know, blue trunks with gold stars. And the other, someone wearing the red, white and blue of the Union Jack. And they're trading body blows, and they're trying to block their blows, and they're fighting for a prize money of, circa 20% of the GDP of the world. And if you pan back a bit and have a look just outside the ring, you have other fighters warming up. You have this 100-foot terracotta warrior from China. You have the sumo wrestler from Japan. You have a cowboy in a 10-gallon hat from the US. And they are fighting for prize money of circa 46% of the world economy. And yet Europe is focusing internally. And I think that is a major issue going forward. Even if you have a look at the island of Ireland issue that we were just discussing. You know, in Hong Kong, in the handover, and I was there for the handover in Hong Kong, you had all these same issues being played out again at that time. And they were issues of borders, they were issues of trade, and it was the UK that negotiated that. I think there's a solution. I think there's precedents for coming to a solution like one country, two systems in Hong Kong. It's not unheard of. And I do think that Europe as a whole and UK need to look far more externally rather than navel-gazing over this problem. And just for context, I voted to remain.
Well, I guess at any time in the last, I don't know, 20 years or maybe 50 years, we could have accused Europe of navel-gazing and have asked it to look beyond itself. But there are some real challenges that do need to be addressed. And I think the worry, and I don't know who wants to respond to this, but there is a worry that or an expectation that it is getting back to, as Peter said, you're almost getting back to some of the old arguments about the core and the periphery. And if Brexit is happening, and if you have a different perspective in Central and Eastern Europe, I mean, is that really a fundamental Europe that a fundamentally different Europe that we may see in a few years' time?
Let me take some of that up. I mean, all that means is that it is a diverse Europe. I think that there's, from an attitudinal point of view, there are several problems in the way we look at Europe. And I think in the Anglo-Saxon countries, the US and the UK, there's far too much of a derogatory attitude to Europe as a concept. Maybe that's conditioned by the crisis of the last 10 years, but the US has got its own issues as well. And I think that's shown that people underestimate Europe, and Europe in the last couple of years is doing okay, and I think the negotiations with Britain are a sign of that. Also, I think we are conditioned, maybe as investors we're conditioned to always expect a dramatically negative outcome. I discount almost entirely any talk of Poland, Ireland, Italy, France leaving the EU. Culturally, emotionally, they're completely different. They are invested in Europe as a concept. Britain socially was never invested in Europe as a concept. It was never fully in, which is why it's now leaving. And then finally, just to bring it to an investment point of view, if you are exercised about Europe or excited about it, the one way I found in the last maybe 2 or 3 years, the one link between politics and markets is FX. We've had a very unusual 2 years in that market volatility has crunched lower, where in the world of politics you've had lots of things happening. They haven't appeared to register in broad markets, but they do register in FX. So, I think next year the Swedish krona, some of the Eastern European currencies, the pound, that's where you will get volatility, and that's where, if you are passionate about Europe for the better or the worse, where you'll be able to express that.
Stephanie, I think that most people in Europe, certainly in the political systems in Europe, see both that now is a right time for Europe, but also a right time for reform of and within Europe. I think they see it in two senses. It's a right time for Europe because, let's take a helicopter view of the West or the world. We have in the United States an administration that is moving the United States somewhat away from engagement with Europe. I mean, the US is going to become less of a power within Europe. We see China rising in the East very dramatically with a very serious sense of purpose and a very serious long-term plan. We see Russia on the march, on our doorstep. We see chaos to the south of us. So we certainly need to hold together and strengthen the arrangements that we have on our continent. And we're in a good position to do so because we have put the Eurozone crisis to a great extent behind us. The crisis of migrants, of refugees, Brexit has had a very unifying effect on the European Union. But there are big challenges. I mean, the whole architecture and policy framework that supports the Eurozone has got to be strengthened. It's got to be completed. You have probably, at last, 2 countries, 2 leaders, Germany and France, Merkel and Macron, capable of providing the leadership to achieve that. on a good day. There are serious economic challenges in Europe of performance and of productivity, but also of divergence between European economies within the Eurozone. But we're facing a major challenge in respect of our defence and security, where Europe is going to have to do more, it's going to have to pool more of its resources, it's going to have to organise itself differently. Now, these are huge challenges, and I think that the sense in Europe is that, I mean, who would have wished it, but because both are different sources of very bad news, both for Europe and the world, but both Trump and Brexit, you know, have had a sort of focusing effect on governments in the European Union. I happen to think that the issues that we face and the challenges that we face in Central and Eastern Europe are actually very serious. We have a situation where a number of member states of the European Union are not simply moving away from our model of how the European Union should be organised, but I'm afraid turning away from certain core values and freedoms that we support across Europe, and moving in a direction which is not just sort of reorientating those countries away from a sort of institutionally and structurally, but arguably rather more fundamentally than that. And I think that is a big issue facing us, which we're going to have to come to terms with. And I don't think it's going to be easy.
Let Michal come back in a second, but Mark.
No, there's two fundamental problems with reform in Europe, because there is a plan. President Macron came up with a plan on a two-stage Europe. Now, part of that plan is unifying corporate tax rates. So if you unify corporate tax rates, you unify regulation, how do small states compete? Why would a company like ours, and we're a very large investor across many countries in Europe, why would a country like ours go to a small state without a tax advantage, without regulatory arbitrage? It just does not work like that. And so that's the first issue. The second issue is that people like Macron or Merkel or others have been very clear that within the confines of Europe, nationalism still plays a big part. And you're seeing the rise of nationalism all across the world. You're seeing that in Macron's stance now, you're seeing that in the US, you're seeing that in China, who wants to be now the world superpower. And, you know, Francis Fukuyama spoke way too soon in 1993, didn't he? And the rise of nationalism, if you don't have tax arbitrage, the question for me is, how does Ireland, how does Luxembourg, you know, how does Poland and Eastern Europe...
Mark, can I ask you a question?
Sure.
If you're just going to continue with an ever-deepening tax arbitrage being practiced by large multinational companies, how are you going to see those companies paying the tax that is due from them in Europe as a whole? Do you not recognise this is a very serious issue, which is generating huge public concern?
I think the real issue, and I think there's, particularly in the digital world, I think some of it's outrageous. And I think people should pay the arbitrage. Well, no, mine's simply a thing of nationalism between countries. How do they compete? So mine's a question. How do they compete? How does Ireland compete?
Okay, but what's the answer to my question?
I think around, well, in the UK, will UK diverge in a post-Brexit world? Certainly.
No, I'm asking a different question. My question is about very large international companies that manage to play different tax jurisdictions off against each other, exercise arbitrage in a way and on a scale that we have not seen, which is leaving government short of taxation and the public very, very angry. How are you going to address that?
So I think that's a fundamentally different question. That is tax avoidance.
It may be, but it's not a bad
well, let me finish then. That is a question of tax avoidance. Yeah. If people are going and routing revenues through a country, that's tax avoidance. Don't agree with that.
But that's one thing that the small states inspire by having the lower rates.
If people, though, are moving jobs to a country and doing legitimate business there, there's always going to be different taxation regimes in the world. Let's give you an example. France, only in the last month, have taken off their wealth tax, which has been there for 32 years. They're doing that very openly to encourage people to come back to France. my question for you, Peter, is that a legitimate form? Now, you may suggest it's not. I would suggest that's a legitimate way that their government is trying to involve investment.
I think it's a very sensible and progressive move by Macron, because I think the wealth tax was punitive, but worse than that, not bringing in the revenues for which it was originally designed. I think people are probably going to end up paying a fairer, more progressive tax in France as a result of the removal of that wealth tax. But again, that doesn't really address the question I'm raising, which is that we have a very serious situation in which large international companies themselves, and they've told me this, do not feel that they are paying enough tax. They do not feel they're paying their fair tax due in Europe. But the system does not require them to pay more tax. What are they going to do? Voluntarily come along to the Inland Revenue Office and write a check? Of course they're not. But they also, domiciled in the United States, headquartered in the United States, face a different problem too. And that is if we change arrangements in Europe so that these large, US, basically, tech companies have to pay more of their fair whack in Europe, there's going to be a huge backlash in the United States, starting with its president, saying, America first, thank you very much. If you're paying more in Europe, you're going to pay less in the United States, and we're not going to have that. So they're in quite a dilemma.
I mean, stepping back a little bit, much though I enjoy the little Barney on the right-hand side. I know, it's very exciting. There is a question actually raised by something that Peter said, but this is an example of one of those issues. At the beginning of the year, we might have seen a glimpse of the possibility that at the end of this year, there would be this reinvigorated Franco-German core. We've talked about the centrifugal forces still concerns in Europe. But the expectation was that you would have the centre would be holding much more strongly because you would have Emmanuel Macron and you would have a revitalised Chancellor Merkel able politically to push forward and come up with solutions to some of these questions. What was a more integrated Europe going to look like? Tina, do you think are we within sight of that? I mean, Peter says on a good day, we've got that in the next few weeks. What do you think, or the next few months?
Well, as I said, I think that we're not looking at more exits, and so the biggest aspect of the European crisis for companies, investors, was Euro breakup. The euro is not going to break up. Michael's right. Americans in particular underestimate the durability of the European Union. But for me, fragmentation risk continues to be the most significant one. So we're not going to have an Italian exit because there won't be a referendum. We're probably going to have a minority government with support spread across 5 parties. Theresa May, I don't care what anybody says about the political logic, could very well be forced out or step down. She's one crisis away, in my view, from that, even if fear of Jeremy Corbyn in number 10 is what keeps the Tory party together. That could take place in the same period as when the UK needs to get a deal in March to really give a signal to companies. Merkel is going to spend the next 3 months easily trying to negotiate a new coalition, so you won't have you'll have a German caretaker government in effect at the same time as we're trying to do all of this. We haven't talked about the Catalan developments, which I think were significantly underpriced, not because I think Catalan independence is coming, but because it may be that the wave of anti-establishment and Eurosceptic sentiment is replaced by something more like regionalization instead, and a return of identity politics. So, we have Swedish elections also next year. I have always said the core countries were more at risk for anti-Eurosceptic movements converging with the anti-immigration sentiment. I think that's still true. Hungary also next year. I think Michael O'Sullivan's point, though, about markets not registering this political volatility is a really important one to come back to. Because first of all, it's never been the case that political risks really had much impact on equity markets, right? And part of what you guys were talking about with arbitrage on regulation and tax is part of that. Multinational corporations, the S&P is breaking records every day. Where does political risk end up having an impact? It's local currencies. It's on the bond markets, but it's also on investor sentiment and FDI and everything else. And so that's sort of been implied across our conversation today. But it's also going to be what's really at stake for Europe going forward, to get control of this narrative and to minimize the potential for further fragmentation, because it's political capital that's required to do any of these things that we're talking about.
I mean, as an economist, I think the reality check I always have is whatever's happening now, how do we think Europe is going to be placed come the next recession? Because we know there'll be another recession. Have any of the things fundamentally that created the crisis last time been addressed? I think you could argue that some aspects have been addressed in some parts of the banking system. But if you look at Italy, you mentioned the politics of Italy, the economics of Italy are still pretty challenging. You look at the nominal growth rate on a really good day over the next few years, the most optimistic forecasters would still have the growth rate lower than the cost of servicing the government debt. So just at a fundamental level, they're no further away from a debt crisis than they were a few years ago. They're not on the verge of one.
A bit further away from a banking crisis, though.
Potentially, although again you have that connection between the banks and the sovereign, which has not been resolved by the crisis. So I just wonder, I mean, Michal, some concerns being raised here about the potential rejection of some European values by the current government of Poland and by others in the region. Come the next recession, do you think you could have the same continued optimism about support for Europe? And this isn't so much about Poland necessarily leaving, but just being a destructive force.
Yeah, I think, well, first of all, remember Poland was the only country to have avoided last recession because of resilience of its economy and the big contribution of exports to GDP that actually doubled 10 years ago. I was actually at the World Bank, IMF at the time. We were dealing with a number of issues in the CE. So now, but in terms of the previous question that was asked about the future, I actually read Europe's history or EU history in French. And in French they say, I remember a French professor telling us, toute crise est suivie d'une relance, which means each crisis is followed by a relaunch or revival. And then when you look back 60 or 70 years down the road, there was the Hague Treaty, and then the Maastricht Treaty, and then the Euro. So I'm optimistic, right? What I'm concerned about, and this is something that you have mentioned, is that we have unprecedented growth globally, 3.7. Highest growth in G7, G7 economies in full employment, which is not good because this doesn't create a sense of urgency for reform. So indeed the question is, what if it comes 2019, 2020, global markets run into some kind of problems, and then we would be faced with an even more increased acute problems, particularly in some countries in Europe which have been facing unresolved economic, productivity, and social problems. So I would say the future will show. At the same time, I also remember it was one of the founders, Jean Monnet, who used to say, Europe will not be created by grandiose ideas. It will be created by concrete tasks and concrete accomplishment. It was around the time of coal and steel community. And when I think about the concrete things that can be done and thought about, including by Franco-German axis, this could be, how you integrate European banks even further. I mean, why don't we come back to talk of mega mergers in Europe? I think mega mergers in Europe in any sectors, in TMT and banking and finance, would have created a very big boost of confidence to Europe as such, to the market. And this is something that can indeed be accomplished globally, because what we are trying to avoid here is a further marginalization of Europe. When you look at the contribution of Europe's GDP to global per capita, it has been in declining trend, and the risk is when you have UK leaving, and UK is attracting 1/3 of FDI in the EU, and it constitutes 1/3 of equity markets capitalization, then you do have a risk of further marginalization. I think we should also think about say a new wave, a fourth industrial revolution, and what is it that Europe can actually accomplish in terms of new technologies, in terms of innovations. This would, in my view, be a very forward-looking statement, but I think it has to be a very concrete task and very complete accomplishments. I wouldn't be worried about Poland or any of the CE countries not to be in favor of such bold moves.
Just to end on a cheery note on recession, I think if the next recession comes, I don't think it will be led by Europe. China has more imbalances. The US is further ahead in the economic cycle. And in Europe in the last maybe 6 years, we've had risk cycles, not business cycles. We're just getting into the business cycles. And I think consumers and corporates in Europe in general don't have much leverage. So if there is a downturn, I personally don't expect it to be severe in Europe. There is a risk, of course. We haven't spoken about the true leader of Europe, who in my view is Mario Draghi. He's the one, I think from a sort of moral and leadership point of view, who's the one to stand out as a leader. And next year, I think it will be a big swing year for the ECB. We may see a pickup in inflation in Europe, and the ECB may be forced to adjust the ending of its QE program. And that may eventually bring some of the political risks at the periphery back into the market space. So for me, that really is the risk for next year.
Agree on Mario Draghi, by the way, and he's going to be badly missed. I think it would be a good idea neither for Germany nor France to put forward a candidate to succeed him. I think it would be better to look to an Irish or a Finn to fill that post, because I think we are going to see a necessary sort of intensification of Franco-German leadership in Europe, and that should not sort of be confused with monopolization of Europe by France and Germany. I think Germany, that has spent so many years, for very good reason, bemoaning the absence of a partner in Paris, now has to recognize that in Macron it does have a partner. I think that Germany for too long has been a bit of a bean counter. You know, I think that Germany has looked at every step that it could take in Europe as a zero-sum game for themselves. I think they've got to, once they get a government, they've got to sort of lift themselves out of that mentality and recognize that in Macron, by no means perfect, obviously, he's after all only a politician, this is a once-in-a-generation opportunity. I mean, here is a guy, Macron, who has the temperament, the capability, and the majority to undertake serious reform in France. We haven't seen that for generations in that country. The French public are showing amazing patience. They're in a sort of wait-and-see mode. They're not instinctively rejecting every sort of change that's being proposed and taking to the streets. The far right has lost momentum in France. The far left has lost traction in France. This is a very, very propitious moment in my view. And what Macron now faces is three essential tasks. One is to drive economic and societal and state reform in France in a really serious-minded way, in the way that he started, but he's got to continue. Secondly, he's got to turn En Marche into a bigger, permanent political movement. I mean, people have really got to have the sense that this is not a sort of flash in the pan, that it represents a serious and permanent structural change in French politics. And then he's got to lead not just in France, but in Europe as well. He can only do that with Germany, and it is Germany's time, once they have their coalition in place, and I'm glad it's looking like it's going to be more like a grand coalition with the Social Democrats rather than a Jamaica-type coalition with the Greens and the populist Liberals. It's Germany's time to step up to the table as well. We've got to see that in Europe.
Right, so from you, Peter, we've got instructions for France and Germany, the sort of wake-up call that you'd like them to have. We've got a tiny bit of time for others to just give us a very kind of final comments, I guess it would be, what's the one thing, if we really think we're now looking at a more optimistic view of Europe, certainly compared to a year ago when many people were quite bleak and certainly investors were very down on Europe, what should we be looking for sort of a clue to how this is going to work out, whether this will be fundamentally different? Very brief.
Well, I think we should be following Macron's lead. He's got a very simple agenda: pro-reform, pro-business, in his case, pro-Europe. I think the pro-reform, the pro-business is fundamental to economic growth, and it's about time the UK government and the UK opposition realised that, woke up and realised that pro-business is going to help the economy of this country. That's first. I think looking externally rather than internally, we should be doing trade deals with the US, with Japan, with China. Peter knows more about that than anyone else, I expect. And if we look externally, once we resolve these issues, and I think we will resolve these issues, I think it can be a nice future.
What should we look at?
Very quick, two things. Small countries as a coalition and as a policy leadership group. And then I think for the next 4 or 5 years, the interplay between monetary and fiscal policy across the Eurozone countries will be the big arbiter of success or not.
I think you're right, looking at what happens to the ECB next year. Sure. Tina?
I think there's one useful common denominator if we look at Macron and even Sebastian Kurz, and in Austria, and with Italian elections coming and the new leader of the Five-Star Movement seeming to gain traction, they're all under 50. There is a real appetite for a changing of the guard, and the issues that Europe and all industrialized democracies face, automation of the labor force and these kinds of things, are not being addressed by the generation of older leaders.
Michal?
Reform versus protectionism. Secondly, accountability versus blame game. And thirdly, don't forget that 7 out of 10 biggest companies, listed companies, are somehow related to the Fourth Industrial Revolution.
Well, thank you, everybody. I can't help feeling, and it's going back to something Tina said, that we're still focused very much on the economic story, the pro-business, the pro-growth story, and our growth is very important, but economists, a very distinguished international diplomat said to me once that it was true that politicians didn't really understand the fundamental rules of economics, and we learned that lesson the hard way in some of the financial crisis. But economists and people in the market sometimes don't understand the rules of politics. I hope we're not making that mistake.
The rules of politics are changing.
Peter Mandelson's a good one to ask about the rules of politics.
But the rules of politics used to be about left and right. Now, left and right still exists, but actually there are new rules in politics. They are about insiders and outsiders. And how we recognise that, understand it, cater to it and come to terms with it is the big political challenge for the West in this century.
I knew you would get the last word. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you.